Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today, we once again welcome back our guest host, music journalist Jon Burlingame, to talk about the movie musical Wicked. As you probably know, the film is a modern adaptation of the hit Broadway musical, and today Jon welcomes the team that helped director Jon M bring Wicked from the stage to the screen. But I'll let Jon take over the introductions from here.
It's my pleasure to introduce key members of the music team of Wicked. Oscar and Grammy-winning songwriter Stephen Schwartz, Tony Award-winning musical director Stephen Oremus, and Oscar-nominated and Emmy-winning composer John Powell. Welcome, gentlemen, and congratulations on a huge opening for this long-awaited film adaptation.
Thank you.
So Stephen Schwartz, getting this movie made seems like a long saga in itself, but I wonder if you can tell us what the process was like in expanding the Broadway score to something that clearly needed to be sort of much grander for the movie.
Yeah, I think it was really trying to think about being cinematic and seeing what Jon Chu was shooting. I mean, first of all, for the songs, obviously, with Stephen Oremus and the rest of the music team, we sort of worked those out for ourselves and with the cast. But then when we saw it shot and saw the rough edit, that changed how we approached the orchestration, some of the arrangements, and then obviously with John Powell, we had to figure out how to support the rest of the movie. So it was basically done as part of the process.
So did you have to cast Cynthia and Ariana in those parts before you even thought about what to do in terms of arrangements or how the songs might change?
Yes, to some extent. In terms of the writing of the songs, the expansion of the One Short Day section, etc., that was part of the work on the screenplay. But basically, the songs are pretty close to what they are in the Broadway Act One of the Broadway show. So it was more once Cynthia and Ariana became part of it, and the other singers as well. I should include Jonathan Bailey because he also brought a lot to his own vocal. Again, with Stephen Oremus and the music team, Greg Wells, etc., we sort of worked out the vocals as we pre-recorded, even though they sang a lot of it live. But then the rest of it was in response to what Jon Chu had, the movie that he was making.
We were in rehearsals for almost 3 months prior to shooting with Ariana and Cynthia. And so much of that, as Stephen said, was figuring out the flow, the feel, the overall shape of everything, of the performances that we were building on. And then what would happen in the process is we would start that way and really focus in on the music and get everything together. And then as we started moving towards shooting, then we would get into the rehearsals with Jon Chu, and we would start walking through and figuring out how it was going to all kind of coexist, because we couldn't just be worried about like, well, they're going to sing it like this, but meanwhile she's going to be skipping across rocks and running across a field and all that, so it was really it was an exciting evolution of kind of seeing it evolve. And as Stephen mentioned, it was so illuminating for us to get to kind of like create the arrangements to the picture and really score it like a film as it is, and make sure that it all made sense to kind of blow up this very rich world in the way that would honor the show.
So it's interesting to me that when you brought in Jon Chu during that rehearsal period, he was sort of figuring out how he was going to stage them, I guess, while you guys were actually in rehearsal before shooting even was happening.
Sure. Well, I mean, it really was about, especially for those two women, I can't stress this enough because the bulk of the score falls to them, especially Cynthia, it really was about them kind of wrapping their voices and their brains around how they were going, how the songs felt in their body, how they would express them, and what how it all worked with how they wanted to tell the story. And then once they got with Jon, we really saw the evolution of how the piece was coming together, how each song was coming together, and we were able to kind of then build off of that.
Yeah, I mean, we had spent so much time, and by we, I mean myself and Winnie Holtzman, when we were writing the screenplay, which of course includes the songs, going through everything very meticulously with John Chu, that basically he came in knowing how his basic ideas for how he was going to shoot it. He had told us a lot so that we could put it into the screenplay. But then, of course, once you're actually there and working with bodies and working within the environment, things will change. But this was, I think, what Stephen and I are trying to stress is that this was an extremely collaborative process all along the way. It wasn't as if we sort of did some music work and then went away and came back and were surprised by what was done with it. When you start talking with John Powell, also, that the score was very much talked out between Jon and myself, and then Jon with John Chu. It was, nobody sort of went off and did his thing by himself.
Every little trait, however small, makes my very flesh begin to crawl. With simple utter loathing, there's a strange exhilaration in such total detestation. It's so pure, so strong. Though I do admit it came on fast, still I do believe that it can last. And I will be loathing you my whole life long.
Stephen Schwartz, talk to me for a minute about the fact that you brought Stephen Oremus on to the film early, and Oremus goes all the way back to the beginning of the Broadway show.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very grateful to Universal for allowing me to have my music team. When we first started working on it, there was sort of the usual music studio discussion about, oh, we want people who have a lot of experience doing movies, and what about this person, and what about that person? And finally, I said, look, there are three guys that I need. I need Stephen Oremus and Dominic Amendum, who Stephen Oremus kind of created the music for the show with me from the very beginning in terms of arrangements, and Stephen was our original conductor, etc. Dominic Amendum came in pretty soon thereafter, and then I knew Greg Wells, our music producer, and I felt as long as I had those three gentlemen working with me, then I was on solid ground. The music was on solid ground, and the studio could bring in whomever else they liked. And then when it came time to talk about the scoring, John Powell was sort of my choice all along, and I was delighted to hear that. In that case, the studio enthusiastically agreed. And fortunately, John was both sort of available. He made himself available and interested.
The time-honored tradition of making a movie musical, as you guys have already alluded to, is you get into the studio, you record all the songs, and then you get to the set, and then you lip sync to the songs during the shooting, which was always thought of as easier to handle in terms of sound and mixing and all that sort of thing. That, I gather, was only the beginning here, because your actors are singing live on set throughout, right?
Yeah, a lot of the time, not all the time.
And why was that? And how? And what did that bring to the final product that you might not have had?
Well, to get more immediate performances, it was everything was always about storytelling and about making it feel as real and as fresh and immediate as possible. There were some areas which simply could not be sung live because of the nature of where they were and what they were doing. But we knew that we were going to be going back and forth between pre-recordings and live performances with the hope that we would have as much live as possible. And therefore, the way the recording was mic'd, both in the studio and on set, was with great consciousness of making sure we had the ability to edit back and forth. And the truth is, by the time we were done, I don't even remember what's live and what's pre-recorded because the sound work was so skillful.
Gonna be popular. I'll teach you the proper ploys when you talk to boys, the ways to flirt and sound slow. I'll show you what shoes to wear, how to fix your hair, everything that really counts to be popular. I'll help you be popular. You'll hang with the right cohorts. You'll be good at sports. Know the slang you've got to know. So let's start, 'cause you've got an awfully long way to go.
Well, it was a testament to Simon Hayes and the sound team, who really was extraordinary. But what I would say also is, I think when we started, John Chu is even like, he was delighted that that they were so game to go live as much as possible. And while we say going live, we went live, but we were syncing we were on the grid and we were syncing. Everyone had in-ears, and we were syncing to tracks, that we had that they had sung to, and everything that we had rehearsed to and everything. So it was really phenomenal to just kind of be able to have all of these tools to be able to bring such incredibly emotionally resonant performances to life.
I mean, there were moments though when Dominic Mendham was on set and just playing keyboard along with, accompanying the performance, and that too had to be sort of all fitted together. The trick was for it all ultimately to sound seamless sonically.
Yeah. So they had a tiny earpiece and they were listening to a pre-recorded track most of the time.
Well, in general, think about it. In order to not get that in their mics, the playback in their mics or anything, that there had to be something that they were listening to sync to. So most of the time, I mean, there were takes where we did stuff without, where they played it softly in the room and they sang along. But in general, everyone was in monitors so that they could hear what they were singing to.
I kept thinking, didn't that complicate the mixing process in post-production? But maybe having a million options was actually better.
It did complicate it, that's true, but in a good way. I mean, first of all, as you say, it was good to have options, but we always knew that that's what we were going to do, and we went in prepared for the complications.
And so talk to me a little bit about how musical is Jon Chu. We know he had done In the Heights for film, and I'm just wondering, when you brought him in, was he sort of game for whatever direction you guys felt like the songs needed to go?
Yeah, Jon is a very musical person. I don't know exactly how to express it more articulately than that. I had known Jon briefly from a television show that we worked on together that didn't wind up happening, but it was a musical television show. His student film for, I think, USC was a musical. And then, of course, when we saw In the Heights, we could see how well he and his choreographer, Christopher Scott, and his editor, Myron Kirstein, responded to music and the way they staged things and the way they cut it together. So, Jon's musical instincts are very strong. John Powell, again, will speak to this because Jon Chu is very specific about what he wants, and often I or John Powell would have to, come to him with several options before we decided on finally what was going to be in the movie.
So I'm also curious about, did you have to build the orchestral accompaniment to these songs after you had decided what takes were the right ones and what the song was going to sound like from the women.
Yes, initially Greg Wells and I put together all of the pre-record along with Dom Mendham. We actually, as we prepped each song for the shoot, we would have everything ready to go and made sure that we were it was all fully MIDI so that we could be nimble and make any change if they wanted to change a tempo, if they wanted to change any little bit, and we were able to kind of build something so that they felt more than just a piano singing behind them. I mean, and so they could feel a little bit of the power of the music. So we based it on some of the original orchestrations. In some cases, we tried out some new things of some directions that we wanted to go in for certain songs. But in general, it was really it was all temp. It was all just to give them a sense of a sense of epicness and a sense of the larger scale of where we were going. And then in post, once we saw once we got the edits, we were able to really, really blow it out to what it needed to.
Yeah, and then Jeff Atmasian came in and did the brilliant orchestrations for the score, but always we were looking at picture. He was always orchestrating to picture. John Powell does his orchestrations, but he has his team that he works with. And again, the goal was seamlessness. Yeah, well, John can speak of them, but just seamlessness. So you'd never know where one left off and one began, but it was all done after the fact to picture.
I'm also curious to know if the 23-piece band you had in the pit on Broadway was easily blown up to whatever you had, maybe 85 or 90 players later, or do you really have to sort of start from scratch and rewrite when you're writing for an orchestra that size?
I think it's sort of a combination. Stephen Oremus and I worked very hard with Bill Brown, our orchestrator, on the original, on the Broadway cast and album and Broadway show, and we really liked those orchestrations. So in some cases, we would say to Jeff Atmasian, we basically want you to do this. We don't want you to reinvent the wheel. We want you to just expand this. But in other places, we said, no, this has to be something different for the movie. So again, everything was kind of collaborative and a combination, always determined by the story and visually what we were looking at.
So much of the stuff was like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know what I mean? Like we really didn't want to. We wanted to honor the scope and some of the colors of the original work, but to be fair, there were certain things. In the orchestration that have become so iconic to us that we were like, oh, we have to have that. We have to have that oboe line. We have to have this. We have to, which was really fun for us having known it for 2 decades. But the truth was, Jeff was so masterful about actually taking the original stuff and basically, and for me to be able to, very prescriptively go, sometimes even like bar by bar or section by section, and say, here's what works, here's what we love, here's what I would love for you to bring. I want you to bring your version of this to the table. And he was able to bring so much more than we ever imagined once we were really responding to the picture, and really brought in a whole incredible cinematic perspective for us in many instances. And it was really extraordinary. In fact, I will say one thing, and it was really early on where Jeff had done an orchestration for one of the pieces, and we hadn't watched it with the picture. He had just sent back. It was very early on. We were just starting to get picture, and he had done an orchestration to Something Bad. And this I found so fascinating and so brilliant. And Stephen and I both kind of like woke up. Like this was like the big eye-opening moment for us in the process, because what he did was he did this big orchestration for Something Bad, and we heard it without watching the picture, and he sent it to us. And I was at Stephen's apartment because we were talking through a whole bunch of other things, and we listened to it and went, oh no, this feels so big, and too broad, and like it doesn't have the colors don't feel like they're right. I don't know, maybe this is not going to work out with this song. Maybe we have to have him do it. And I said, you know what, let's wait, let's get the picture. He sent the picture. They sent it to picture, like one of our music editors put it to picture, sent it to us, and we watched it and went, oh, it's perfect, it's phenomenal, it's amazing. And I said this to Jeff, at Magian, and I said, Jeff, I said, I just have to commend you. I said, both of us were really curious about how this was going to work with this song, but you really captured something so beautifully once I saw it to picture. And he went, oh, yes. He said the picture absorbs the sound. And we said, oh my God, you're right. It was amazing. It really was. And for us, like working so immediately as theater artists and in a live space, it really was about that, like laying it into that room and with those visuals and how that all came together so beautifully. And that really opened our eyes for the whole process. It was really incredible.
I have to ask you about Defying Gravity, which now becomes the climax of a movie, as opposed to the last song in Act 1 of the show. Did it need to be expanded or broadened in any sense musically?
Well, it is expanded because one of the things that we needed to do in the movie that we don't need to do in the show is to give a hint about the story to come in movie 2. So we needed to see what was happening with the other characters who are not involved in the immediate scene of Defying Gravity. And therefore, we came up with this idea that she would be flying over Oz, singing singing a riff on the Unlimited theme, which I wrote and expanded so that we could get an idea of what was happening with Bach and Fierro and Nesseros, etc. But other than that, we pretty much stuck to what's in the show, except for the score moments, except for when she jumps out the window, for instance, or when the guards are attacking and trying to pull them out of a balloon, and there's a lot of action going on. We were lucky with this movie that because it's in 2 parts, we get to have a musical that ends in an action sequence, which you just, when do you get that? So that was a gift to us of the splitting it in 2 parts.
It's time to trust my instincts, close my eyes, and leap. It's time to try defying gravity. I think I'll try defying gravity, and you can't pull me down.
Can't I make you understand? You're having delusions of grandeur.
I'm through accepting limits, 'cause someone says they're so.
Other than that extended unlimited section, there's nothing in terms of what's sung that extends and expands it, but there's a lot in terms of what's scored, which again, my endless gratitude and admiration for John Powell, because he was able to do the parts of that, the scoring in that section that he did, without your being aware that you're going in and out of song and score.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great point. And now I do want to talk to Mr. Powell. I'm sort of curious to know at what point, John, you were brought in here and how you and Stephen Schwartz collaborated on what needed to be done musically in a dramatic sense.
Well, I really was, this film was, 22, 23 years being made, as it were. And so I'm coming in for this tiny portion, really, even though it was a good chunk of time. It was a tiny portion compared with everybody else. And actually, I'm never sure whether I should say this or not, but I think it's significant, Stephen. Is like when I first had, lunch with Stephen, I had to admit that I had not seen the show. And I was very nervous about about it because I didn't know quite whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. And everybody else in the whole production was just, knew everything. I knew nothing. And I think we decided maybe it was okay because this was a film. This was going to be a movie, a real movie. And that's, I think, what Jon always wanted. And I think, the process of changing it from one form into another probably could do with somebody who would just come in and see it, this new way. And in a way, to tell you the truth, I did see the musical eventually, but not until after I'd seen the film. I saw the film first.
Okay, so I'm curious to know how much of the score is rooted in the melodic material of the songs, or maybe the rhythmic material too, or how much of it needed to be fresh and new?
I think that evolved. That was the thing the thing about Stephen's writing is when I really started to look at all the songs, there's just so many brilliant tunes and shapes and bits of things. It was a gold mine, absolute gold mine of everything I could ever wanted. What became more apparent later on, I think, was that, and I'd forgotten this, was that everybody, and especially Jon Chu, also had lyrical connections to tunes, which I'd never thought about before, which meant that if I was using the wrong musical motif, which I may have thought would be perfect, it would have lyrical connections, and that would sort of damage really storytelling. So I think there was, we had a good 2 or 3 days where Stephen and I sort of absorbed Stephen's process, tried to sort of get him to go right back to the beginning of how it was all written, and just, I wasn't trying to just learn everything. I was also just trying to sort of see where it all came from so that I could try and, absorb that. And I think really what the score ended up as was this mixture of, trying to absorb the shapes, the harmonic language, everything that Stephen was giving me, but then eventually trying to see through the camera lens and Jon's perspective, so that it always felt like it came from the same place, but it was for this new way of looking at the story.
So Stephen Schwartz, knowing that this was going to be necessary and a great deal of new music, essentially, even if rooted in your material, was going to be necessary for the film, I wondered, did you maybe go back and look at things that you had left out of the show and think, well, gee, we maybe we could use this material, or maybe you wrote some new material? I'm sort of curious about your element here.
Yeah, we didn't really go back. Basically, John Powell and I went through the themes, the motifs, and talked about what does this mean emotionally. When we hear this particular tune, some of them, as John says, have connection to lyrics where one has to be careful. But John wound up incorporating in the sections that he did, the intro to For Good, or again, what we call the unlimited theme, or something that is played right before Madame Morrible sings, those sorts of things that don't have the connection to the lyric or the riff of Defying Gravity, that bum 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 bum, all those things that don't have, when the audience hears them, even if they know the score by heart, they're not suddenly singing words along, but they do connect to characters, to emotions, to parts of the story. And basically we just talked through those and made decisions about how we thought we would use them. And then if it was a section that I was doing, I tried to use that process in the same way that Jon did in the sections he did. But again, I feel the seamlessness that Jon brought to this is extraordinary. It's extremely generous, for one thing. I find it because it could so easily have sounded like, okay, there's the song. Now we're in score. We're kind of in two different things, and the fact that it doesn't do that, I think, is a big tribute to Jon.
There's a magical quality to a lot of that score, and I thought it was some of the most beautiful work I've heard all year. I want to specifically ask you about the choral material, which just is wonderful, and it in a couple of spots sort of reminded me of the scene setting in the 39 Wizard of Oz that Herbert Stothard had done, because there's something magical about that too. But let me ask you, am I on any kind of the same wavelength?
Well, that's very much a Jon thing as well. It's one of the things that Jon always said to me was, he wanted to bring this truly American folk tale, to the movies, and the irony being it sort of started for most people in the movies. So that language is part of the history of this storytelling, and I think he really wanted to keep that. One of the great things was we did get to do, there's lots of choral work in New York as well for all the songs and everything, but we managed to do this choral session, and we got to do it on the MGM stage, which is where they recorded it.
That's right. They recorded the original Wizard of Oz there.
Yeah, so there we were singing that stuff, and I'd done my best, and I always loved those arrangers at that period. Their vocal writing was just the choral parts and everything else like that. It was amazing. So yeah, I was definitely inspired by that.
Let me ask you about the orchestra that you used both to accompany the songs and in the score. Was much of that recorded around the same time? Did you do a lot of orchestral sessions sort of at the end of post-production? And was the same orchestra basically used for both?
It was slightly larger for the score, I think. I think our complement was for the songs were around 85.
Jon's orchestra was a little bit bigger, but we did do the song orchestrations. That was all post-production, but we did do them in 1 week, and then John Powell, you did another week, and then you went back after the movie was. Because the movie wasn't quite finished, and so of course some things changed and then had to be rescored.
It was largely the same group, though. The same set of musicians. Phenomenal group in London. It was just thrilling to be on that podium.
Where did you record in London?
It was all done at Air Studios.
And do you record regularly there, Jon? Is that a favorite spot?
Oh yeah. It's a fantastic studio. It's very rich, so you get a lot. You do get a lot, so you have to be wary of that. And actually, in a way, it was great because we had the same engineer, Nick Woolwich, recording them, and we tried to keep, even if we had slightly more horns and a few more strings and things like that for the scoring session, we basically kept the same setup as much as possible, so that you could kind of go. And that was one of the things we did with Andy Nelson as well. We tried to mix so that he had all the same elements. Everything was laid out the same way for him as much as possible.
One of the great things about Air Studios, and I haven't done this enough to know if this is common or not, but it was very useful for us there, is that they can lower or raise the ceiling and give you a bigger, so if you wanted a very kind of rich string sound that, we kept saying, like, this needs to sound like, the old time MGM strings, then you would have the ceiling very high, so you'd get a lot of room. But if it had to be more pop and more right on the beat, then you could bring it down and make it punchier. And that was very useful both in the studio, and I have to say that the orchestra that got put together was very good at adjusting styles. If Stephen Oremus and I would hear something and we would feel like, no, this has to be like more pop, they could do that. Or if we said, think great big rich movie score, they would do that. And the combination of the way the orchestra played and the way the studio itself was configured really helped us with that.
And I'm curious to know, when you know your film is going to be in a big sort of Dolby Atmos situation, do you record any differently or mix any differently?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there was more microphones. I mean, Dolby is the Atmos thing is just in fact, I'm in an Atmos room. I'd move the camera so you can see my Atmos setup, but it's extraordinary for music. I've found it allows us to get the orchestra and the music into a place away from dialogue and things in a way that we'd never be able to do before. So yeah, we had lots of experiments. Everybody's still kind of playing around with it, experimenting, but we have lots of different options, and we pass that all the way along through to the dub. So Andy Nelson, the final arbiter of that.
Similarly, with the song portions, Greg Wells mixed everything in 7.1 on a separate in a separate editing suite, and we were passing things back and forth to the dub to kind of get to translate it, to make sure that the two rooms were slightly different, but it was hugely helpful and really it really helped put the whole puzzle together in a much more cohesive way. And Andy Nelson is a legend. I mean, what he's done is just so extraordinary in wedding all of it together.
So Stephen Schwartz, there's no new song in part 1. Will we get new songs in part 2?
Yeah, I've been asked by the studio not to give a whole lot away, but there are 2 new songs in part 2, and there is also some more playing around with existing material the way we did in part 1 with One Short Day. Again, storytelling always ruled, and we talked about the possibility of a new song in the first part, and I actually came up with something and we experimented with it, but ultimately it just felt we didn't need it, and we didn't want to just put something in just for the sake of putting something in. And then in movie 2 there are dramatic situations that kind of demanded new material, new musical material, so that's why two new ones in part 2 and no new ones in part 1.
Well, it's really exciting to sort of imagine what we might be in for. Powell, before I forget, how big was your choir on the MGM stage here?
Somehow I managed to persuade Universal. I think they were obviously looking the other way, for 60.
Oh, great. So that's why it's so rich sounding.
I mean, sometimes we do it with smaller groups and then you kind of track them. But I mean, I do find that and LA is, I will say this, is LA has got this extraordinary sort of choir now. The Master Choral is as good as any choir ever I've heard for classical. But also then it turns out that a lot of them can sort of flip and do all this other stuff as well. But, it was wonderful to do that. And it's wonderful to do it here in that room as well.
Stephen Schwartz, I want to give the last question to you. It seems to me that this story is more relevant and timely than ever. And I wonder if the many delays that you endured between pandemics and strikes and everything, maybe turned out to be a blessing in disguise in terms of the timing of this movie.
Well, I think the amount of time we had to work on it, to think about it, to during pandemic be on Zoom calls with John Chu, et cetera, all of that worked to the advantage of the storytelling of the movie and everybody making the same movie. In terms of its relevance, I wish that were not the case. I wish that instead of it becoming more relevant, giving from a political and societal point of view, I wish it felt dated. But because we'd live in a better world, but unfortunately it doesn't.
Well, I can only say it's a great job, you guys, and I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today. Thank you again, Stephen Schwartz, Stephen Oremus, and John Powell.
Thank you.
Many thanks to John, Stephen, and Stephen for joining us on the podcast today. And thanks to Jon Burlingame for conducting yet another excellent interview. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Universal Pictures for helping us put together that conversation, as well as for providing the clips of the film and its music. Be sure to check out Wicked, now in theaters in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. We will have links, as always, in our show notes. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, you can head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.